In 2004, a quiet Norwegian professor sitting in an Iowa University office was doing what professors do. He was running numbers. He wasn't investigating anything. He wasn't trying to expose anyone. He wasn't working for the SEC, the FBI, or any government agency. He was just doing math. And then he noticed something impossible. What he found would trigger one of the largest corporate fraud investigations in American history, bringing down over 2,000 companies, costing executives billions of dollars, and landing some of the most powerful CEOs in the country in handcuffs. And the man at the center of it all? He just wanted to finish his research paper. This is the story of Erik Lie, and the accidental discovery that shook corporate America to its foundation. To understand what Erik Lie discovered, you need to understand one thing about how executives in America get paid. In the 1990s, Wall Street fell in love with something called stock options. The idea was simple and elegant. Instead of just paying your CEO a massive salary, you give them the option to buy company stock at today's price, let's say $10 a share, at any point in the future. If the company does well and the stock climbs to $50, the CEO buys at $10 and immediately profits $40 per share. Multiply that by millions of shares, and you've just created a billionaire. The logic behind it? If the CEO's wealth is tied to the stock price, they'll work harder to grow the company. Everybody wins. By the late 1990s, stock options had become the single most important part of executive compensation packages across corporate America. Tech companies were handing them out like business cards, but there was a problem with this system that almost nobody was talking about. Stock options are only valuable if the company's stock price goes up after you receive them. If you're granted options at $10 and the stock drops to $8, those options are worthless. You're underwater. And here's where human greed enters the picture. Some executives, at first a few, then dozens, then hundreds, started asking a very dangerous question. What if we didn't have to wait and see where the stock goes? What if we could look back in time, find a date when our stock price was at its absolute lowest, and just pretend that's when we granted the options? That practice had a name: backdating. And by the mid-1990s, it had quietly become one of the most widespread forms of executive theft in American corporate history. Here's how backdating actually worked, and why it was so easy to get away with. Say you're the CEO of a tech company. On March 15th, your company's stock is sitting at $10 a share. Your board of directors meets and formally grants you stock options at that price. But last month, on February 1st, your stock was at $6. You remember that. Everyone remembers that. So here's what some CEOs started doing. They would take those March 15th options, find a clean February 1st date on the calendar when the stock was at its lowest, and simply change the paperwork. They'd file documents claiming the options were granted on February 1st at $6 per share. Then, when the stock climbs to $20, instead of profiting $10 per share like they were supposed to, they profit $14 per share. The extra $4, stolen from shareholders, from the company, from every person who owned a single share of that stock. Now here's what made this especially sinister. Most of the people doing this didn't even think of it as stealing. It had become so common, so routine, so casually practiced across Silicon Valley that executives treated it like a perk, a standard operating procedure, a way to make sure good options didn't go underwater if the market had a bad quarter. Nobody talks about it at board meetings. Nobody puts it in the minutes. It's handled quietly between a CEO and a human resources vice president, buried in paperwork that auditors rarely scrutinize closely enough. Between 1996 and 2005, an estimated 18.9% of all unscheduled stock option grants to top executives in the United States were backdated or otherwise manipulated. That's not a rounding error. That's not a few bad apples. That's nearly 1 in 5, across more than 2,000 companies. And nobody, not the SEC, not the Department of Justice, Not a single financial regulator in the country had caught it. Erik Lie was born in Norway. He served in the Royal Norwegian Navy before pursuing a career in academic finance. By 2004, he was a professor at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business, mild-mannered, unassuming, and deeply interested in one specific question. Why did executive stock options always seem to make money? Not just sometimes, not just usually. Always. It had actually been noticed before. A New York University finance professor named David Yermak had spotted the pattern back in the 1990s. Executives seemed to receive their stock options right before the stock price climbed. He assumed it was because executives knew good news was coming and timed their grants strategically. But Erik Lie looked at the data differently. He noticed that it wasn't just the stock price going up after the grant date. The stock price was also at an unusually low point right before the grant date. The stock would dip, then grants would appear, then the stock would rise. With perfect, statistically impossible timing. Again and again and again. Lie ran the numbers with increasing disbelief. The probability of this pattern occurring naturally, by chance, by brilliant executive intuition, was essentially zero. There was only one explanation that fit the data. Someone was going back in time, looking at historical stock prices, and choosing the lowest possible dates. Someone was backdating. In 2004, Erik Lie published his findings in a paper called On the Timing of CEO Stock Option Awards. The academic world noticed. The financial press noticed. And then in March 2006, the Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story suggesting that executives at 6 major companies may have been backdating their grants. Within weeks, the SEC launched a formal investigation. Within months, it had exploded into the largest executive fraud probe in American history. What followed was a reckoning that shook corporate America to its core. The SEC opened investigations into over 140 companies within the first 6 months alone. By the time the dust settled, more than 2,000 firms had been implicated. At least 70 top executives lost their jobs. Dozens were criminally charged. Some went to prison. The first CEO to go to trial was Gregory Reyes of Brocade Communications, a Silicon Valley data storage company. Reyes had been named one of the 400 wealthiest Americans by Forbes magazine. He was in his late 30s, worth an estimated $1 billion, and widely celebrated as a tech visionary. Prosecutors accused him of doctoring company records and lying to investors and auditors about Brocade's options practices. The scheme was simple: grant options to employees, then forge paperwork to show those options had been granted on a different date when the stock was lower. A San Francisco jury convicted him on all 10 counts of securities fraud. 21 months in federal prison, a $15 million fine. But the most jaw-dropping case was United Health Group, one of the largest health insurance companies in America. Its CEO, William McGuire, had been celebrated as one of the greatest executives of his generation. Under his leadership, United Health's stock had risen more than 5,000%. He appeared on lists of America's best-paid, most admired executives. What investigators found was that McGuire had been backdating his own option grants for years, amassing an options package worth billions of dollars through manipulation. The settlement was staggering. William McGuire agreed to resign and surrender more than $600 million in stock option gains and retirement pay. $600 million, handed back. And then there was Apple. Steve Jobs, famously paid just $1 per year in salary, but granted enormous stock options as compensation, admitted that he had been aware of backdating at Apple. Jobs himself was not charged. Instead, Apple quietly fired 2 lower-level executives, and the matter was closed. One of the most powerful CEOs in history, who took a dollar salary while secretly benefiting from a manipulated option system, walked away without criminal consequences. while Gregory Reyes wore prison stripes. That contrast, a small company CEO in handcuffs, a Silicon Valley icon in a black turtleneck, said everything about how justice operates at different levels of power. Here's what I want you to think about. The executives who backdated options weren't stealing from some faceless corporation. They were stealing from shareholders, which means they were stealing from pension funds, from retirement accounts, from teachers, firefighters, nurses, and ordinary workers whose life savings were invested in the stock market. Every dollar of options profit that was manufactured through backdating was a dollar transferred from those people to the executive pocketing it. And the most disturbing part? According to Erik Lie's research, an estimated 30% of all companies that granted executive stock options between 1996 and 2005 engaged in some form of manipulation. 30%. This wasn't a scandal. This was a system. Sarbanes-Oxley changed the reporting requirements in 2002, forcing companies to report option grants within 2 days. Backdating became nearly impossible overnight. The pattern in Lie's data dropped dramatically the moment that law took effect, which tells you everything. The only thing that stopped it was making it harder to hide. Not ethics, not corporate culture, not internal compliance departments, a 2-day reporting window. Erik Lie never set out to be a whistleblower. He didn't work for a government agency. He didn't have a personal stake in any of the companies he exposed. He was a professor doing math. And because he was methodical enough to notice a pattern that shouldn't exist, and honest enough to publish what he found, one of the most entrenched frauds in American corporate history was finally dragged into daylight. The boardrooms are still full of the same incentive structures that created backdating in the first place. The options are still there. The pressure to hit performance benchmarks is still there. The gap between what executives earn and what ordinary workers earn is wider than it has ever been. Erik Lie did his part. The question is whether anyone in those boardrooms learned anything from it. Based on the evidence, probably not.